In the velvet-lined hierarchy of organized crime, the Don is king, and the Maid is just wallpaper. At least that's what Christian Bastoni believed. He was the third-generation heir with the instincts of a predator and the arrogance of royalty. He thought he owned the courtyard. He thought he knew everything about the quiet young woman refilling his Chianti. But on a golden afternoon in Tuscany, when a half-dead homeless man stumbled past armed guards and whispered a warning that turned blood to ice, the hierarchy shattered because that terrified stranger didn't beg the powerful Don for mercy. He pointed one trembling finger at the girl with the snake tattoo and destroyed the illusion with 7 words. Look at her neck. Then run! This is the story of Bella Maldini and why you should never judge an assassin by their apron. Bella Maldini had been invisible for 183 days, and in approximately 4 minutes, she would stop being furniture forever. She moved through the Tuscan courtyard with the practiced shuffle of the perpetually overlooked, her grey uniform blending into the limestone and terracotta like camouflage. The afternoon sun painted everything gold, but Bella existed in the shadows between the important people, the spaces where eyes didn't bother to focus. Her hands, calloused beneath white cotton gloves, carried a crystal decanter of Chianti Classico, worth more than most people earned in a month. To the 15 men celebrating in the courtyard, she was worth considerably less. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Christian Bastoni sat at the head of the long table, like a Renaissance prince holding court, his navy suit tailored to perfection, his dark hair swept back with the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having to try. He was 32 and newly crowned, the youngest Don in the Bastoni family's century-long history. His father's funeral had been 3 weeks ago. The bullet holes in the old man's Maserati were still being buffed out in a garage in Florence. Bella had served that funeral. She'd poured the wine while the family wept crocodile tears. Salute! Christian raised his glass, and 14 voices echoed him. The crystal sang. The men laughed. Bella refilled the water glasses at the far end of the table, her eyes downcast, her footsteps silent on the ancient stone. She had learned to move like smoke, and to exist without existing. It was the first lesson of the Ouroboros, and the last thing most targets ever understood. 2 minutes and 55 seconds. A guard stationed near the ivy-covered wall shifted his weight, and Bella logged it automatically. Left knee favoring. Old injury. The man beside him kept glancing at his phone. Distracted. Sloppy. The head of security, a bull-necked enforcer named Dante, stood behind Christian's chair with his hand resting on his sidearm. Professional. Dangerous. He would have to die third, after the 2 closest to the kitchen exit. Bella had memorized every sight line in this courtyard, every shadow deep enough to hide a body, every door that locked from the outside. She knew which flagstones were uneven enough to trip a running man, and she knew the acoustics would swallow a scream if you angled it towards the fountain. She knew that Christian Bastoni took his espresso with 2 sugars, feared his uncle more than God, and had never once looked her in the face. That oversight would cost him everything. 2 minutes and 10 seconds. The Rossellis think they can move product through Livorno without paying tribute. Christian was saying, his voice carrying that particular pitch of masculine certainty that Bella had heard in 1,000 targets across 12 countries. They think we're weak because Papa is gone. Tomorrow we show them what the Bastoni family does to thieves. The men around the table nodded, their faces hard with borrowed conviction. Bella circled behind them, the decanter growing lighter in her hands. She was a ghost passing through their celebration, a non-entity in grey cotton who existed only to serve. When she reached Christian's right shoulder, she paused, waiting. 1 minute and 40 seconds. He didn't acknowledge her. His hand simply rose, fingers snapping twice in the air beside his head like he was summoning a dog. The sound was sharp and dismissive, a gesture so automatic he probably didn't even register making it. His eyes never left the face of the underboss across the table. His expression never flickered with the awareness that another human being stood 6 inches behind him, close enough to touch his neck, close enough to feel the pulse beating beneath his expensive cologne. Bella tilted the decanter. The wine poured in a perfect burgundy stream, filling his glass exactly 3/4 full. Not a drop spilled, not a sound made. She was very good at being nothing. 1 minute. Grazie, Christian said absently, the word thrown over his shoulder like spare change. He still hadn't looked at her. In 6 months of service, he had looked directly at Bella Maldini exactly twice. Once when she'd been hired, a 3-second glance at a resume he didn't read, and once when she'd stumbled near the stairs, a flicker of irritation that she'd dared to exist loudly enough to notice. 45 seconds. Bella stepped back, her face a perfect mask of servile emptiness. Inside, beneath the uniform and the performance and the 6 months of careful invisibility, something ancient and patient began to wake. The serpent tattooed along her neck seemed to pulse with anticipation, though of course that was impossible. Tattoos didn't move, but killers did. And in 30 seconds, when the homeless man crashed through the garden gate screaming warnings nobody would believe, Christian Bastoni would finally see her. It would be the last mistake he ever made. The first gunshot came from the front gate, and every man at the table reached for a weapon except Christian, who merely raised one irritated eyebrow. In his world, violence was a servant that came when called, not an interruption to be tolerated during celebratory wine. "Dante," he said, his voice bored. "Handle it." But before the head of security could move, the ornate iron gates burst open and a figure stumbled through, propelled forward by 2 guards who looked equal parts confused and furious. The man was a disaster of tangled hair and unwashed clothes, his face obscured by a grey beard that had seen neither scissors nor soap in what appeared to be months. And he wore layers of ragged coats despite the Tuscan heat, and his boots were held together with what looked like electrical tape and prayer. "I have to see him!" The homeless man's voice cracked with desperation, his hands raised in surrender even as the guards shoved him forward. "Please, I have to see the Don. It's a matter of life and death." The courtyard had gone silent except for the scrape of chairs as Christian's men stood, hands hovering near concealed firearms. Bella remained exactly where she was, the decanter still in her gloved hands, her face carefully arranged in an expression of mild alarm appropriate for frightened household staff. But her weight had shifted almost imperceptibly to the balls of her feet. 15 seconds early, the variable she hadn't predicted. "We found him trying to climb the wall." "Ah, boss," one of the guards said, his hand twisted in the homeless man's collar. "Kept screaming he had information. Want us to dump him in the road or put a bullet in him out back?" Christian studied the intruder with the detached interest of a man examining an insect that had wandered onto his plate. Around the table, his soldiers had formed a loose perimeter, weapons drawn, faces hard. The mathematical calculus of violence hung in the air like the scent of gun oil and expensive wine. "Information?" Christian's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "What information could a creature like you possibly have that would interest me?" The homeless man swayed, his chest heaving, his wild eyes scanning the courtyard with a jerky, panicked intensity that read as either madness or methamphetamine withdrawal. His gaze swept across the guards, the armed men, the table laden with crystal and silver, and then stopped. He'd found Bella. The change in his expression was instantaneous and terrible. Every ounce of desperate performance drained from his face, replaced by recognition so pure and primal it transcended language. His eyes, surprisingly sharp beneath the matted hair, went wide. His mouth opened. The color fled from his weathered cheeks like water from a broken dam. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. Bella's hand tightened fractionally on the decanter's neck. The serpent tattoo beneath her collar seemed to burn. The timeline was collapsing. The perfect orchestration of her 6-month infiltration was unraveling because a homeless man who should not exist in her carefully constructed plan was staring at her like she was death incarnate. "Well?" Christian's voice cut through the silence, impatient now. "Speak or bleed. I'm not particular about which." The homeless man's gaze snapped back to Christian, and something shifted in his ravaged features. Fear, yes, but beneath it something harder. Something that looked almost like resigned purpose. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The desperate crackle was gone, replaced by something lower, steadier, terrifyingly sane. "My name is Alexander Cross," he said, pronouncing each word with the careful precision of a man trying to be heard over the sound of his own racing heartbeat. "And I'm not here to beg for money. Don Bastoni, I'm here to save your life." Laughter erupted around the table. One of the underbosses actually slapped his knee. Even Dante cracked a smile, his hand relaxed on his weapon. The idea that this wreckage of a human being could save Christian Bastoni from anything was apparently the finest joke they'd heard all afternoon. But Christian wasn't laughing. He was leaning forward slightly, his predator's instinct engaged by something in the homeless man's tone. "Is that so? And what exactly am I being saved from?" Alexander's eyes flicked once more to Bella, just for a fraction of a second, and in that glance was a universe of terror and desperate calculation. When he looked back at Christian, his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing the Don to strain to hear. "Not what?" Alexander said. "Armed who?" The courtyard seemed to hold its breath. "She's been in your house for 6 months. Alexander continued, his words tumbling faster now, racing against time or fear or both. "You trust her because she's invisible. You don't even see her face. But I've seen that face before, Don Bastoni. I've seen it in my nightmares for 3 years. "Enough," Dante growled, starting to move forward. "Boss, let me put this crazy bastard out of everyone's—" "Wait." Christian's hand rose, halting his security chief mid-step. His dark eyes had gone very still, very focused. "Who are you talking about?" Alexander's hand came up, one trembling finger extended, pointing across the golden afternoon courtyard, past the armed men and the crystal glasses, and the careful architecture of power. He pointed directly at Bella. "Her," he whispered. "Look at her neck, then run." The world compressed into a single moment of perfect violence waiting to happen. Alexander tore free from the guard's grip with a strength that shouldn't have existed in his malnourished frame, launching himself across the courtyard toward Christian with the desperate momentum of a man who had nothing left to lose. The guards reacted instantly, a chorus of safeties clicking off, barrels tracking, fingers tightening on triggers. "Don't shoot!" Christian's command cracked through the air, his hand raised. Not from mercy, but from curiosity. The predator in him wanted to understand the prey's final play. Alexander covered the distance in 3 stumbling strides and collapsed against the table's edge, his face inches from Christian's, his breath coming in ragged gasps that smelled of desperation and old coffee. The guards closed in, weapons trained on his skull, but he ignored them entirely. His wild eyes locked onto the Don's with an intensity that transcended sanity. "Look at her neck," he whispered, the words so quiet that only Christian could hear them, so urgent they seemed to vibrate with their own frequency. "The snake! Run!" Christian's expression flickered with irritation. "What are you—" "Please!" Alexander's voice cracked. "I know what I sound like. I know what I look like, but I'm begging you, Don Bastoni, look at her neck before it's too late. The black snake. Look at it and run." Something in the homeless man's tone penetrated Christian's armor of arrogance. Perhaps it was the specificity. Perhaps it was the absence of performance. Perhaps it was simply that in 32 years of lies and manipulation and theatrical displays of loyalty, Christian Bastoni had learned to recognize the sound of absolute truth. He turned his head. Bella stood exactly where she'd been standing, the crystal decanter still in her gloved hands, her posture perfectly subservient. But she was watching them now, her dark eyes steady and calm, and there was something in that calmness that made the air feel suddenly colder. Christian's gaze travelled up from her grey uniform to the collar, to the pale column of her throat, to the edge where fabric met skin. There, rising from beneath the modest neckline, rendered in black ink so dark it seemed to drink the golden afternoon light, was the head of a serpent. Its scales were intricately detailed, each one a tiny masterwork. Its eyes were chips of void. Its mouth was open, fangs bared, and the body coiled downward, disappearing beneath the fabric, impossible to trace, impossible to measure, eating its own tail, eternal, Ouroboros. Madonna, Christian breathed, the word barely audible. You see it. Alexander's whisper was triumphant and terrified in equal measure. You see it. Now run. But Christian couldn't run. He was frozen, his brain struggling to reconcile 6 months of invisible servitude with the implications of that mark. He'd seen that symbol before, whispered about in the kinds of conversations that happened in locked rooms with no recording devices. The Ghost Guild, the myth, the assassins who didn't exist except in stories designed to frighten children and ambitious men. Bella? His voice sounded strange to his own ears. She tilted her head slightly, and the gesture was all wrong. It wasn't the uncertain movement of a frightened maid. It was the curious consideration of a predator hearing its name spoken by prey. Yes, Don Bastoni. Her voice was the same soft, deferential tone she'd used for 6 months, but now, somehow, it sounded like music written in a minor key. What is that on your neck? Bella's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles could cut. A promise. The transformation happened in the space between heartbeats. Her posture straightened, her shoulders rolling back, her spine aligning with a dancer's precision. The subservient shuffle vanished, replaced by a stillness so absolute, it seemed to bend gravity around her. Her eyes, which had spent 6 months carefully avoiding direct contact, now locked onto Christian with the flat, measuring gaze of a butcher considering a side of meat. She set the decanter down on the table with careful precision. The crystal rang softly against stone. Dante, Christian said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Take her into custody, carefully. The head of security moved forward, his weapon trained on Bella's center mass, his approach textbook perfect. 3 feet away, 2 feet, close enough to grab her arm. Bella's hand disappeared into the front pocket of her apron. Gun! Someone shouted, but it wasn't a gun. When her hand emerged, it held a blade that seemed to have been forged from condensed shadow, its edge so sharp it appeared to bend light around itself. The knife was perhaps 6 inches long, entirely black, and gripped with the casual familiarity of a surgeon holding a scalpel. Dante fired. The bullet should have taken her in the chest, should have ended the threat, should have restored the natural order where Don Bastoni's security chief was the most dangerous person in any room. But Bella had already moved. The bullet screamed through empty air where she'd been standing, and she was beside Dante now, behind him, the blade already moving in an arc so fast it sang. Blood misted the golden afternoon air. Dante's body hit the ground with the heavy finality of fallen architecture. Bella stood over him, her grey uniform unmarked, her breathing unchanged, the black knife dripping red onto ancient stone. "Hello, Christian," she said, and her voice was silk wrapped around broken glass. "We should talk about your father." The courtyard erupted into chaos. 14 men reaching for weapons with the synchronized panic of prey animals, realizing the wolf was already among them. But Bella was faster than panic, faster than training, faster than the synapses firing in their combat-honed brains. Her left hand, the one not holding the knife, pressed something small and black that she'd pulled from her apron's second pocket. A remote, Christian realized with dawning horror. One of the estate's security remotes that should have been locked in his office safe. The sound that followed was mechanical and final, the pneumatic hiss of steel shutters descending from hidden housing built into the villa's Renaissance architecture. His father had installed the system 5 years ago, into a fortress protocol designed to seal the estate against outside attack. Plate steel barriers dropped over windows. Reinforced doors engaged magnetic locks. The ornate iron gates that Alexander had stumbled through moments ago slammed shut with a sound like a bank vault closing. In 15 seconds, the courtyard transformed from an open celebration into a killing box. "Shoot her!" Someone screamed, and the air filled with the percussion of gunfire, muzzle flashes strobing against ancient stone. But Bella had already moved, flowing behind one of the marble columns with the liquid grace of mercury finding cracks. Bullets chipped terracotta and shattered crystal. The celebration table exploded in a shower of wine and glass. The guard closest to the column, a man named Rico, who'd served the family for 8 years, tried to angle for a shot. Bella emerged from behind the marble like a shadow, gaining substance, and her blade found the soft junction where his jaw met his neck. The knifework was surgical, precise, a single stroke that severed everything important. Rico's gun clattered to the stone. His body followed. "Formation!" One of the underbosses shouted, trying to impose order on the pandemonium, suppressing fire on the... Bella vaulted onto the table, her boots finding purchase between overturned glasses and scattered silverware, and launched herself at the second nearest guard. The man, younger and faster than Rico, actually managed to track her movement, his pistol coming up, his finger finding the trigger. But Bella's knife hand moved in a tight circle, redirecting his barrel towards the sky, and her other hand drove something small and metal into his eye socket. A fork, Christian realized distantly. She'd grabbed a fork from the table mid-leap and weaponized it in the time it took a heart to beat. The guard's scream was cut short by Bella's knee driving into his throat. "Run!" Alexander's hand seized Christian's arm with surprising strength, yanking him from his chair. "Don't be here when she finishes with them." Christian's pride wanted to resist, wanted to stand and fight and prove that Don Bastoni commanded his own estate. But his survival instinct, honed through a lifetime in a business where hesitation measured the distance between breathing and bleeding, overrode ego. He ran. They sprinted across the courtyard, while behind them, the architecture of violence continued to collapse. Gunfire echoed off stone. Men shouted tactical positions and prayers in equal measure. Bella moved through them like a surgical instrument cutting through soft tissue, her grey uniform now decorated with arterial spray, her movements economical and terrible. The villa's main entrance loomed ahead, tall oak doors carved with the Bastoni family crest. Christian hit them at full speed, his shoulder driving into wood, and they gave way into the marble-floored entrance hall. Alexander tumbled through behind him, and together they slammed the doors shut, throwing the heavy iron bolt. "That won't hold her," Alexander gasped, bent double, his chest heaving. "Nothing holds them. You don't understand what she is." "I understand she just killed my head of security and locked us in my own goddamn house," Christian snarled, his hands shaking with adrenaline and rage and something he refused to name as fear. "What I don't understand is how a homeless lunatic knows about the Ouroboros when I thought they were a fucking myth. They were supposed to be." Alexander's eyes were haunted. "Until one of them came for me in Prague 3 years ago. I survived because I got lucky and she got careless. Your maid out there, she won't get careless." Through the heavy doors, the sounds of combat were diminishing. Individual gunshots now, instead of sustained fire, the wet sounds of bodies hitting stone. A scream cut short. The mathematical reduction of 15 armed men to whatever number Bella deemed acceptable to leave alive as witnesses, or inconvenient to reach in the time she'd allocated. "How long do we have?" Christian asked. Alexander checked an expensive watch that looked absurdly incongruous on his ragged wrist. "Based on the timeline in Prague? 4 minutes, maybe 5 if your men are better trained than they looked." And then she comes through those doors and finishes what she started 6 months ago when she applied for a job serving wine to the man who killed her father. The entrance hall suddenly felt very large and very empty, full of shadows that could hide a grey uniformed killer with a black knife and infinite patience. From beyond the oak doors came a final gunshot, then silence. The silence was somehow worse. They made it to the library on the 2nd floor, Christian leading them through corridors he'd walked 1,000 times, but which now felt like enemy territory. Every shadow could hide her. Every corner could conceal that black blade. The villa that had been his fortress for his entire life had transformed into a labyrinth designed for his execution. The library doors were solid walnut reinforced with steel cores, another paranoid installation from his father's final years. Christian threw the bolt and dragged a leather wingback chair against the entrance for good measure. Though he suspected if Bella wanted through, furniture wouldn't slow her any more than locked doors or armed guards had. "Talk," he commanded, rounding on Alexander. "And it better be the truth, because if you're running some kind of con, I swear to Christ, the Ouroboros aren't a myth." Alexander collapsed into one of the reading chairs, his ragged layers incongruous against the burgundy leather and floor-to-ceiling books. "They're a guild, ancient, selective. They don't take contracts like normal assassins. They take vendettas." Christian moved to the window, in his hands shaking as he tried to peer through the gap in the security shutters. The courtyard below was a tableau of stillness and blood, bodies arranged with almost artistic precision. No movement, no Bella. Vendettas. He repeated flatly. Personal grievances, blood debts, the kind of grudges that justify years of preparation. Alexander's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent 3 years thinking about nothing else. "They don't shoot you from a rooftop or poison your drink at a restaurant. That would be merciful. That would be quick. Then what do? They become part of your life." Alexander pulled off one of his filthy coats, and beneath it Christian glimpsed a shirt that might have once been expensive, the costume of a homeless man worn over someone else entirely. They infiltrate, a new assistant, a driver, a bartender at your favorite restaurant. They learn everything about you, your schedule, your habits, your weaknesses, your secrets. And when they finally strike, it's not just murder, it's revelation. They make you understand exactly why you're dying and exactly how blind you were. Christian's mind was racing, rewinding through 6 months of Bella serving coffee and changing linens and standing in corners while he discussed business that could get people killed. The security briefings she'd been present for, the phone calls she'd overheard, the arguments with his uncle about succession that had happened in rooms where she was replacing towels. "The woman who came for me in Prague," Alexander continued, "she'd been my accountant's assistant for 18 months. She knew my financial passwords, my travel schedule, where I kept my backup weapon. She knew I was allergic to shellfish, so she made sure the safe house they chased me to had an EpiPen in the medical kit. Not to save me, to make sure I didn't die from anaphylaxis before she could cut my throat." Madonna. Christian turned from the window, his face pale. "Bella's been here for 6 months. She knows everything." Alexander finished. "Where you sleep, when you sleep, which guards are loyal versus which ones are just collecting paychecks, where you keep your weapons. She probably knows which floorboards creak, which doors stick, which windows don't lock properly. Christian moved to his father's desk, yanking open drawers with increasing desperation. The Beretta he kept in the top drawer was gone. The backup piece in the false bottom was gone. Even the antique letter opener that could double as a stabbing implement was missing. "She's been preparing the battlefield for half a year," he said, his voice hollow. "This entire villa is her weapon. Not just the villa, you." Alexander stood, moving to the library's bar cart and pouring 2 fingers of scotch with shaking hands. "She knows how you think, how you react under pressure. She's been studying you like a doctoral thesis. That's what the Ouroboros do. They don't just kill you, they know you better than you know yourself." Christian's mind flashed to a dozen small moments. Bella adjusting the thermostat without being asked, because she knew he preferred the study at exactly 20 degrees. Bella steering him away from the shrimp appetizer at last month's dinner party, but mentioning softly that the kitchen had concerns about freshness. Bella somehow always knowing which scotch to pour, which newspapers to leave folded on his desk, when he wanted silence versus conversation. He'd thought she was simply an exceptional servant. She'd been an exceptional hunter. "My allergies?" he said suddenly. "She knows I'm allergic to penicillin. It's in my medical file," which she's read. Alexander drained his scotch. "Along with your psychological evaluations, your security protocols, probably your browsing history. The Ouroboros spend years becoming invisible experts on their targets. By the time they strike, they know you better than your therapist." "Then why tell me?" Christian demanded. "Why crash through my gate and warn me if she's been planning this for 6 months? Why not let her finish it?" Alexander met his eyes, and in them Christian saw a recognition that transcended their circumstances, the understanding of one marked man to another. "Because she killed my wife," Alexander said quietly. "Not quickly, not mercifully. And before she died, my wife looked at me and said the same thing I'm telling you now. You never saw her coming because you never really looked." From somewhere in the villa below came the sound of a door opening with careful precision. The hunt had resumed. "Are you enjoying this story? Before we continue, I need you to comment if you are." "Thank you for doing that. Let's continue." The lights died with a click that echoed through the library like a guillotine blade falling. Not the gradual dimming of a power outage, but the surgical precision of someone who knew exactly which breaker to throw. The emergency lighting should have kicked in immediately, bathing the villa in the pale glow of battery-powered LEDs. But Bella had apparently anticipated that too, because the backup systems remained as dark as the primary. "She's in the electrical room," Christian said, his voice tight in the sudden blackness. "That's on the ground floor, West Wing. We're trapped up here." "No." Alexander's voice came from somewhere to his left, followed by the sound of books being pulled from shelves. "We're not trapped. You just don't know your own house. I know every room in this villa. My family has owned it for 3 generations. You know every room your family uses." There was a click, and a small LED flashlight blazed to life in Alexander's hand, its beam revealing a section of exposed wall where leather-bound volumes had been. "But the people who built this place 400 years ago understood something about power that you've forgotten. The masters need to be served, and servants need to be invisible." Alexander's fingers found a recessed panel in the wall, pressing in a specific sequence that suggested this wasn't improvised knowledge. A section of bookshelf swung inward with a whisper of well-oiled hinges, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. The walls were bare plaster, the space barely wide enough for a single person. Dusty electrical conduits and ancient pipework ran along the ceiling. "How did you—" "I told you. The one in Prague knew everything about my safe house. After she died, I became obsessed with understanding how the Ouroboros think. They don't just study their targets, they study the architecture, the infrastructure, anywhere a servant would need to access, to maintain the illusion of comfort. Alexander ducked into the passage, his flashlight beam dancing across cobwebs and decades of accumulated dust. Every grand house has these, the spaces between the spaces. Your maid has been using them for 6 months. Christian followed, his expensive suit scraping against plaster, his mind reeling at the implications. He'd walked past this library wall 1,000 times, sat at that desk reviewing ledgers and planning operations, never suspecting that behind the books there existed an entire network of passages he'd never seen. Where do they lead? Everywhere servants need to go without being noticed. Alexander moved with surprising confidence through the darkness, I taking turns without hesitation. Kitchen to dining room, laundry to bedrooms. These corridors are how your maid changed your sheets without you ever seeing her enter your bedroom. How your coffee appeared on your desk while you were reading emails. You thought she was just efficient. She was mapping escape routes, and ambush points, and places to hide bodies. The passage narrowed further, forcing them to move single file. The air smelled of old wood and older dust, the scent of spaces designed to be forgotten. The irony is beautiful, Don Bastoni, the king of Tuscany, master of the Bastoni Empire, hiding in the walls of his own castle, running through passages built so the people you don't see can serve you without disturbing your sense of supremacy. Christian wanted to rage at the condescension in Alexander's voice, but the homeless man's words carried too much truth. He'd been so certain of his power, so comfortable in his dominion, that he'd never bothered to learn the infrastructure that maintained it. Bella had changed his sheets, and he'd never wondered where the clean linens came from. She'd served his meals, and he'd never considered the path from kitchen to table. She'd been invisible because he'd needed her to be, and that invisibility had been her greatest weapon. They emerged into another passage, this one running parallel to what Christian recognized as the main hallway. Through ventilation grates he could see slivers of the corridor beyond, elegant and familiar and utterly useless. The doors were all locked from the outside, the weapons were all missing, the guards were all dead. She's hunting in the main villa. Alexander whispered, killing his flashlight. Looking for you in the obvious places. The master bedroom, your study, your father's office, places where the Don would hide. How long before she realizes? A sound froze them both. Footsteps in the passage ahead. Light, measured, moving with the confidence of someone who'd walked these hidden corridors 100 times before. The beam of a flashlight swept around a corner 50 feet away, and in its glow, Christian saw her. Bella moved through the servants' passage like she owned it, her grey uniform still splattered with blood, the black knife loose in her right hand. She wasn't searching frantically or moving with haste. She was simply walking, patient and inexorable, checking the spaces she knew existed because she'd been living in them for 6 months. She knows, Christian breathed. Of course she knows. Alexander's hand found his arm in the darkness, pulling him backward. She's Ouroboros. She knows everything. They retreated deeper into the walls, the irony complete. The Don and the homeless man, equal now in their desperation, fleeing through spaces built to keep servants separate from their masters. Behind them, Bella's footsteps kept coming, steady as a heartbeat, patient as time. The servants' passage deposited them into a narrow hallway behind the kitchen, the air thick with the ghost of 1,000 meals cooked for people who never thanked the hands that prepared them. Alexander's plan had been simple. Use the hidden corridors to reach the armory in the villa's east wing, where Christian's father had maintained enough firepower to outfit a small rebellion. But simplicity died the moment they heard her voice. The armory is empty, Christian. Bella's words drifted through the darkness, impossible to locate, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. I removed the firing pins from every weapon 3 months ago, during the Easter party, while you were toasting your father's memory. I had 45 minutes. It was more than enough. Alexander's flashlight revealed a door marked Cucina in faded paint. He shouldered through it, and they stumbled into the villa's industrial kitchen, a cathedral of stainless steel and copper that had been designed to serve banquets for 100 guests. Commercial ranges lined one wall. Copper pots hung from ceiling racks like metallic stalactites. The massive refrigeration units hummed with electrical life on their backup generators, on the only systems Bella had apparently left operational. "She's herding us," Christian hissed, scanning the shadows between the prep stations. "This is exactly where she wants us. Then we make it work for us instead." Alexander moved to the ranges, his hands flying across knobs, igniting burners with practiced efficiency. Blue flames bloomed in the darkness. "She's had 6 months to prepare. We've got 6 minutes and a kitchen full of improvised weapons. Sometimes desperation is its own advantage." A copper pot crashed to the floor near the walk-in freezer, the sound explosive in the confined space. Both men spun toward it, but there was nothing there, just swinging metal and shadows. "Psychological warfare," Alexander muttered, filling a massive stock pot with oil from the storage shelf. "She's playing with—" Bella emerged from behind the refrigeration unit like a nightmare gaining substance, her grey uniform rendering her nearly invisible against the stainless steel. The black knife came around in an arc designed to open Christian's throat, and only his Mafia-honed instincts saved him. He threw himself backward, his spine cracking against a prep counter, and the blade whispered past his jugular with a millimeter to spare. She followed through with balletic precision, her boot catching his knee, and Christian went down hard on the tile floor. Pain exploded up his leg. Above him, Bella raised the knife for a finishing stroke, her face calm and terrible in the blue glow of the range burners. A copper pot the size of a car tire crashed into her skull. Alexander had torn it from the overhead rack and swung it like a medieval flail, the impact staggering Bella sideways. She recovered with inhuman speed, pivoting toward this new threat. But Alexander was already moving. He grabbed a handful of black pepper from the spice rack and flung it into her face. Bella's eyes streamed instantly, her next knife strike going wide, embedding in a cutting board instead of Alexander's chest. "Move!" Alexander hauled Christian to his feet, dragging him between the prep stations, while behind them Bella ripped the knife free and pursued. They wove through the kitchen's geography, using industrial mixers and storage racks as obstacles. But Bella knew this terrain as intimately as she knew everything else about the villa. She'd worked here for 6 months, preparing meals Christian had consumed without seeing her hands. Christian's knee buckled, his leg refusing to support his weight properly. Something torn or fractured, adrenaline temporarily masking the full damage. He grabbed a carving knife from a magnetic strip as he fell, more instinct than strategy. And when Bella came around the corner, she had to abort her strike to avoid his wild slash. The hesitation cost her half a second. Alexander used it to reach the stock pot he'd been filling, now sitting on the range's highest burner, the oil inside beginning to shimmer with heat. Not boiling yet, but getting close. He grabbed the pot's handle with a dish towel wrapped around his hand. "Down!" he screamed at Christian. Christian dropped flat. Alexander swung the pot in a wide arc, and 3 liters of 375-degree oil fountained through the air in a liquid amber wave. Bella tried to dodge, her reflexes superhuman, but physics didn't negotiate with assassins. The oil caught her left side, splashing across her arm and shoulder, and for the first time since the courtyard, she made a sound. A sharp intake of breath. Not quite pain, but acknowledgement of damage. She retreated 3 steps, her injured arm hanging differently now, the grey uniform sleeve darkening with oil and the beginning of burns. Steam arose from her skin, but her knife hand was still steady, still ready, and her eyes held no fear, only calculation. "You're better than I expected," she said, her voice unchanged despite the injury. My research suggested you were soft, arrogant, that you'd break easily. Your research missed something. Christian gasped from the floor, his knee screaming. I'm my father's son. No. Bella's smile was terrible in the blue flame light. Your father died begging. Let's see if genetics hold true. She came at them again, knife low and lethal, and the kitchen erupted into violence once more. They made it to the wine cellar through sheer desperation, and Alexander's seemingly infinite knowledge of the villa's hidden geography. A service staircase behind the pantry, steep stone steps that descended into cool darkness that smelled of earth and fermentation and centuries of expensive taste. Christian half fell down the stairs, his injured knee buckling with every step, leaving a trail of blood from a cut across his ribs he didn't remember receiving. Alexander slammed the heavy oak door at the top of the stairs and threw the iron bolt. It wouldn't hold her long. Nothing had held her yet. Help me! Christian gasped, limping toward the racks that lined the cellar walls. Thousands of bottles lay in careful horizontal repose, his father's legacy and obsession. Bordeaux from years that had produced legendary vintages, Barolo older than Christian himself, cognac from the 1800s worth more than luxury cars. We can barricade, we can't fight her. Alexander's voice cut through Christian's panic with the cold clarity of mathematics. You've seen what she can do. She's faster, better trained, and she's been preparing for this night for 6 months. We barricade ourselves in and we just die tired. Then what? Christian's hands shook as he gripped a wine rack for support. We're trapped in a cellar with one exit and a killer on the other side of that door. What brilliant strategy does the homeless oracle suggest? We stop running. Alexander moved deeper into the cellar, his flashlight beam scanning the vaulted ceiling, the ancient stone walls, the carefully climate-controlled environment that maintained perfect conditions for aging wine. We can't outfight her, so we outsmart her. She's been outsmarting me for half a year. Because you thought you were smarter than everyone. Alexander pulled a bottle of grappa from a rack, checked the label, nodded with satisfaction. But she's made one mistake tonight, the same mistake every perfect predator makes. She started to believe in her own invincibility. From above came the sound of the door bolt being tested. A pause. Then the methodical impact of something heavy being applied to wood. She was coming through, patient and inexorable as always. What do you need? Christian asked, the words tasting like surrender and survival in equal measure. Every bottle of high-proof alcohol in this cellar, grappa, cognac, any barrel-strength spirits, and I need you to trust me enough to stand in the open when she comes through that door. Christian's blood went cold. As bait. As the only thing she's been focused on for 6 months. Alexander was already pulling bottles, his movements efficient despite the tremor in his hands. She wants you dead, Christian. That's the only thing that matters to her. We use that focus. We make it her blindness. They worked in frantic silence, pulling bottles and arranging them in a pattern Alexander directed with the precision of an architect. A semicircle around the cellar's center, each bottle opened, the alcohol splashing across the stone floor in aromatic pools. The smell was overwhelming, grape and grain and oak, decades of careful aging reduced to accelerant. The door above splintered, the sound of wood cracking under sustained assault. The flare gun. Alexander said, Your father's emergency kit, where is it? North wall, red metal box. Christian's mind was racing, seeing the trap take shape, understanding the desperate geometry of it. This is insane. It's the only advantage we have. She knows everything about you except whether you're brave enough to stand still when death comes walking. Alexander found the flare gun, checked the load, his face grim in the flashlight's glow. Your father died begging, she said. Prove genetics don't hold true. The door above gave way with a crash that echoed through the cellar like a judgment. Footsteps on the stone stairs, measured and unhurried. Bella descended into the cool darkness, her silhouette backlit by the faint emergency lighting from the floor above. The black knife caught the light like it was carved from void. "Christian." Her voice carried no triumph, only the flat finality of a job being completed. "There's nowhere left to run." "I know." Christian stepped into the center of the cellar, into the killing ground they'd prepared, his injured leg barely supporting him. Every instinct screamed to flee, to hide, to preserve the life he'd built on the foundation of his father's empire. But Alexander was right. Running had only delayed the inevitable. Bella moved down the last few steps, her burnt arm held closer to her body, but her knife hand still steady. She registered the opened bottles, the alcohol pooled on the floor, the trap they'd set. Her eyes flicked to the shadows where Alexander crouched with the flare gun. She smiled. "Clever," she said. "But fire spreads slowly. I'll kill you both before the first flame reaches." "Now!" Christian screamed. Alexander pulled the trigger, and the cellar filled with light and fury. The flare ignited the alcohol vapors before it even hit the floor, a whoosh of flame that transformed the wine cellar into a momentary vision of hell. Fire raced across the stone in branching rivers of blue and orange, following the paths they'd laid, consuming a century of carefully curated vintages in seconds. The heat was instantaneous and enormous, sucking oxygen from the air, turning the cool cellar into a furnace. Bella was already moving, her assassin's reflexes carrying her backward toward the stairs even as she processed the threat. But Alexander had planned for that too. The bottles they'd arranged in the semicircle weren't just fuel. They were fragmentation devices. The heat shattered glass in a cascading chain reaction, spraying alcohol and razor-sharp shards in every direction. A shard caught Bella across the cheek, drawing a line of blood. Another embedded in her already burned shoulder. She twisted, trying to avoid the worst of it, but the geometry of the trap was perfect. Every direction offered only fire or glass or both. Christian threw himself behind a stone support column, feeling the heat scorch the air where he'd been standing. Through the flames he could see Bella, her grey uniform igniting in patches, her knife still gripped in her hand, as if the blade was the only reality that mattered. Even burning, even bleeding, she moved toward him with the terrible patience of her training. A burning ceiling beam, destabilized by the heat, gave way with a crack. It fell directly in her path, forcing her to dodge left, into the section of the cellar where Alexander had concentrated the highest proof spirits. The old cognac, some of it over 100 proof, created flames that burned blue-white and hungry. Bella's sleeve caught fully now. She dropped and rolled with professional efficiency, smothering the flames. But the moment of vulnerability was enough. Christian grabbed a broken bottleneck and lunged, driving the jagged glass toward her with all the strength his injured body could muster. She deflected it almost casually, her knife describing an arc that should have opened his throat. But the burns had slowed her fractionally. The smoke had degraded her vision, and for the first time in 6 months of perfect preparation, Bella Maldini made a mistake. The blade caught his shoulder instead of his neck, cutting deep but not fatal. Christian crashed into her, both of them going down hard, on stone, slick with wine and blood. The knife clattered away into the flames. They grappled like drowning swimmers, each trying to gain the leverage that would mean survival. Bella's burnt arm gave her less purchase than her training demanded. Christian's injured knee made him clumsy. They were both damaged, both desperate, and both reduced to the animal mechanics of staying alive. His hands found her throat. Her knee found his ribs. They rolled through broken glass and spreading fire, and somewhere in the violence Christian realized that Alexander was above them, the flare gun discarded, holding instead a full bottle of grappa like a club. "Down!" the homeless man shouted. Christian threw himself sideways. The bottle descended with brutal force, catching Bella across the temple. The glass held for one perfect moment of impact, then exploded, drenching her head and shoulders in clear alcohol that ignited immediately. She screamed then, not from pain, but from rage, from the realization that 6 months of preparation had been undone by desperation and luck and a homeless man who should have been irrelevant. She tried to rise, her hair burning, and her uniform charring, but her body had finally reached its limits. Bella collapsed onto the stone floor, and Christian scrambled forward, using his jacket to smother the flames consuming her. Not from mercy, but from need. He had questions. He needed answers. "Who hired you?" he demanded, his face inches from hers, his hands pinning her shoulders. "Who paid the Ouroboros?" Her eyes, still sharp despite everything, found his. Blood ran from the cut on her cheek. Burns covered half her face. But she smiled, and in that smile was something worse than hatred. "Your uncle," she whispered, her voice damaged by smoke but still clear. "Vittorio. He promised us everything if we made it look like the Rossellis. He wanted the empire. He wanted your father dead and you discredited. We took the contract because—" She coughed, blood flecking her lips. Because your father killed mine in Naples. 17 years ago. Business, he called it." The world tilted. Uncle Vittorio, his father's brother, the man who'd stood at the funeral with tears in his eyes and promises of loyalty on his lips. "The Ouroboros doesn't just kill for money," Bella continued, her voice fading. "We kill for blood. Your family has been destroying families for generations. Did you think there would never be a reckoning?" Her eyes closed. Her breathing became shallow. Around them, the fire was consuming itself, running out of fuel, leaving only smoke and ruin and the wreckage of assumptions. Alexander helped Christian to his feet, both men coughing, burned, bleeding, but alive. Dawn found them in the courtyard, and sitting on the steps where 12 hours ago Christian had held court as the untouchable Don of the Bastoni family. The security shutters had been manually cranked open by Alexander, who apparently knew how to override every system in the villa. The bodies of Christian's men had been covered with tablecloths, a dignity they hadn't earned in life but deserved in death. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone in the village would have seen the smoke, called the authorities. Questions would come. Stories would need to be constructed. The careful machinery of power and influence would grind forward. Christian pulled 2 cigars from his jacket pocket, miraculously intact. He lit both with a gold lighter that had belonged to his father, then handed one to Alexander. The homeless man took it without comment, and they sat in silence, watching the sun paint the Tuscan hills gold. The same color as yesterday's celebration, but everything had changed. "You saved my life," Christian said finally. "You listened when I told you to run," Alexander replied. "That made you smarter than most men with your kind of power." "What happens now?" Alexander drew on the cigar, his eyes distant. "You have a family war to prepare for, an uncle to deal with, an empire to secure or abandon, depending on whether you learned anything tonight. And you? I disappear. It's what I'm good at." He stood, preparing to leave, but Christian's hand on his arm stopped him. "Stay." The word came out harder than intended, so Christian softened it. "I need someone who sees the invisible things, someone who looks servants in the face. Someone who'll tell me the truth, even when it's inconvenient." Alexander studied him for a long moment, reading something in Christian's face that hadn't existed 24 hours ago. "The hierarchy has changed," he said finally. "Yes," Christian agreed, looking at the courtyard where he'd once sat as king, blind and arrogant and utterly convinced of his supremacy. "It has." They sat as equals, smoking cigars in the ruins, while the sirens grew louder and the sun rose on a world that would never look quite the same. The invisible had become visible, and the king had learned to see. Now let's talk about the psychology of invisibility and power blindness. This story illuminates a critical truth about human perception and organizational vulnerability. We don't see what we've been socially conditioned to overlook. The invisibility phenomenon. Research in social psychology confirms that people in positions of power often develop inattentional blindness toward subordinates. Studies show that executives can work alongside support staff for years without remembering their names or faces. This isn't cruelty, it's cognitive efficiency gone wrong. Our brains filter out what we categorize as irrelevant to conserve mental energy. Security through assumed hierarchy. The story demonstrates how institutional hierarchies create exploitable vulnerabilities. Every organization has invisible infrastructure, cleaning crews, maintenance workers, assistants, who possess comprehensive access but minimal scrutiny. Real-world security breaches frequently exploit this blind spot. The most devastating corporate espionage often involves someone in a dismissed role. The danger of dismissal. Christian's fatal flaw wasn't trusting Bella, it was never considering her worthy of distrust. When we categorize people as beneath notice, we grant them perfect camouflage. The lesson. True awareness requires seeing everyone as fully human and potentially significant. Power without perception is vulnerability wearing a crown. The people you don't see are often the ones who see you most clearly.